Hello everybody. For today's video, I thought I would talk a little about another thing we see very commonly in the folklore with fairies, which is this sort of idea of interdependence between fairies and human beings, or more specifically, the way that fairies sort of rely on or need humans in specific ways. And this is another of those things that sort of gets either glossed over or ignored a lot in the more modern perceptions and understandings of fairies that we see being perpetuated, but is something that was really standard in the older folklore and is something that we still see as being sort of understood in the more traditional cultural views. So I think it's important for particularly Americans who want to connect to or understand fairy beings to have an understanding of this particular aspect of them, if you will. So there's a couple different ways that we see this idea playing out in the folklore. And one aspect of it, of course, which I think I'm going to do a whole separate video on, maybe next week, is the idea of fairies specifically stealing or taking people. And I've mentioned it, I think, in previous videos, but I've never really discussed it. It is a really large topic in and of itself, so it deserves sort of its own video. But I do want to just mention it here because it does illustrate a way in which the fair folk do rely on or depend on interaction with humans for their own well-being, if you will, for their own purposes, might be a better way to explain that. So we'll get more into that in a separate video down the line. But for our purposes today, suffice to say that there is a very long history of folklore and anecdotal material relating to the idea that for various reasons the fair folk, many different kinds of fair folk, need humans for assorted purposes and will physically take human beings. And we touched on that a tiny bit in the last video on fairies and the dead, the idea that some human beings, when they die, do go into the world of fairy and do become fairies. And that is an aspect of this, that humans are necessary to sort of perpetuate the fairies themselves. That is a very massive topic, so I will do a separate discussion about that. But I want to touch on it here at the beginning because it's sort of a baseline for how interdependent and symbiotic the relationship can be between human beings and the fair folk. We also see a lot in the anecdotal material, particularly the Irish, and you can go up, there's a site called Duchas.ie, DUCHAS.ie, if I'm remembering it correctly and spelling it correctly. And that is a collection of different anecdotal material that was gathered in the early 20th century by school children in Ireland, talking to just various people in locations throughout the entire island, as far as I'm aware. And a lot of it does touch on fairy lore, and you'll see examples of pretty much everything I've been talking about in all of these videos in that source. But it's a very good place to go to for the anecdotal material. And something we see there, as well as in the different texts that I often reference, Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, The Good People, the works of Catherine Briggs, is the idea that the fairies, particularly in Ireland, need a human being to be involved in order for them to engage in specific activities. particularly warfare and sporting events. Hurling is often mentioned. So the idea seems to be that they require a human or human intervention in order for themselves to physically appear and interact in our world. It's unclear as to why this is, but it's very well documented. There's a lot of cases where people talk about, they're just going about their business, walking home, doing what they do, and they see a group of fairies in a field, perhaps looking like they're getting ready to start some hurling or playing with a ball or, doing whatever. And one of them calls out to the person and invites them to join the game or sometimes to referee the game, with the idea that they can't actually play or engage in the sport unless there's a human being there. We also see accounts, and this shows up as well in McNeill's Festival of Lunasa, where the fairies engage in warfare between different groups, usually between provinces in Ireland. Each province has its own king or queen, and they tend to get into these battles over the harvest with each other, which is what McNeill was referencing. And there are some accounts where they require a human being, one single human being, to fight with them on their side in order to engage in the battle. We really don't know for certain why this is. There's nothing explicit in the material that says, why do they need a living human to do this? I will point out this does not always end well for the human. There is at least one account by Yeats of a human who is sort of brought in to this warfare aspect of it between two groups of fairies that are not getting along. The human sides with one group of the fae against another. His group actually does win, but the other group never forgets that he sided with their enemies, and they do eventually get revenge on him by sending the Amadan na Bruna. It's a fairy fool in English, and the person is driven mad, effectively, loses his senses because of his aid of this one particular group of fairies. So not always something that works out particularly well for the human, but it is something that we see across a wide stretch of folklore and anecdotal material. The idea that a human presence, a living human presence, is needed in order for the fairies to engage in these activities. I do want to also specify that these are very clearly described as physical activities. Humans who are involved in some cases talk about having bruises or, physically feeling themselves playing the game. So it's not like they're just watching sort of spectral things happening. They have actual physical sensations associated with them. There are also some other accounts, again, of a slightly more grim nature, of the sluishi, or fairy host, coming down and kidnapping a person, generally someone who's walking alone or traveling alone at specific times of year. The sluishi comes down, takes the person, and then sort of forces the person to participate in sometimes more benign mischief, sometimes more outright malicious activities against other human beings, up to and including further kidnapping people who are not returned. Generally, the person who's initially taken by the slua is returned at some point to mortal earth, although often at a great distance from where they were taken in the stories and anecdotal accounts. So, I realize I'm talking fast. It's a lot of material, and I'm trying to keep the videos to around 20-25 minutes, so I'm talking quickly. Wrapping up all of this particular section is just this idea that in order for the fair folk to successfully engage in particular activities in our world, they do need a human being to be present or to participate with them. And that is an idea that goes back quite a long ways in the material we have in writing and in personal accounts. And that is certainly one aspect to the way that human beings and the fair folk are sort of intertwined. We also have quite a lot of material, anecdotal material and folklore material relating to the idea of fairies needing to borrow from humans. There's enough of this, actually, that Catherine Briggs sort of gives it its own chapter in one of her books, The Fairies in Tradition and Literature, and she just sort of titles it Fairy Borrowing, if I remember correctly. It's a sort of complicated idea on its own, and there's different aspects to it. The fairies do just outright steal from humans, and that's sort of a different category. I had mentioned when I talked about fairy offerings and why we make offerings, the fact that they will just outright take food and take things that they believe are owed to them. That's a little bit of a different subject. What we're talking about here is the idea of borrowing and repayment. And in these cases, whatever is borrowed is either returned or some sort of recompense is given in exchange for what is taken. So probably the most well-known in the category of fairy borrowing is the idea of midwives to the fairies, which is human midwives who are temporarily taken in order to attend a fairy birth and are then returned to the mortal world. Probably the most well-known of these stories are the ones where the midwife accidentally touches her own eye with a fairy ointment that gives the sight vision of the fairies, and this is later discovered by the fairies, and they then blind her in punishment for being able to see them when they don't want to be seen. But there are other variations of this, other versions in the folklore, other anecdotal accounts, where the woman is simply borrowed to attend the birth, attends the birth successfully, and is then returned. Usually paid very well for her services. And in some cases, there have been accounts of midwives who were borrowed, as it were, repeatedly over a period of time to attend various fairy births. And it is pretty clear in the accounts that they are not just attending the birth of some neighboring human being that they didn't happen to know beforehand. There's always something sort of fantastical about the situation. Often, whatever home they're taken to when they leave, it's not there anymore. The journey to the home usually involves this sort of very otherworldly traveling through darkness and between stones and all sorts of things like that. So even when it's being done repeatedly and the woman sort of proves to be a trusted fairy friend, it's still clearly not interacting with mortals. They are borrowed, they're returned, they're paid, and it works out well enough in those cases for the person, usually because they're following the rules, as it were, the rules of fairy etiquette. So that's one example. Another of the more well-known examples of this sort of fairy borrowing is the idea of them borrowing. Usually it's described as corn or wheat. Corn, for those who aren't familiar, when you see the term corn coming up in older Irish or British accounts, they don't literally mean what we would in America think of as corn. It's just an old sort of generic term for any sort of ground meal. Wheat, oatmeal, barley, it all just tended to be called corn in the older written material. Keep that in mind. They don't literally mean corn. So we see accounts of fairies borrowing things like that. In that case, it's true borrowing. They're not just taking it and it's gone. Usually they would appear and ask if it was all right if they could borrow it, and the person would give permission. They would take a specific amount, and it would always be repaid. As I believe Alan Lee and Brian Froud mentioned in their book Fairies, although this is seen across folklore, that's just the first reference that pops into my head. They would borrow wheat and they would repay with barley, and they would always repay more than they borrowed. There's a couple interesting things going on there. There's sort of a hint in folklore that potentially fairies did not actually grow their own wheat, that barley or oats were sort of their crops, and wheat was a human crop. I don't want to digress too much into that, but that is something we see discussed sometimes in the academic material. But they would always pay it back. It just wouldn't necessarily be paid in kind. And they did usually pay back more than they took. There are also accounts we see in some of the anecdotes where they would borrow what they needed and they would pay it back in money. Literally, the person would lend it one day, and the next day they would find silver coins on their table, that sort of a thing. So, there's this clear implication with this aspect of borrowing, that whatever was borrowed would always be returned and paid back, but not necessarily exactly the way that it was borrowed. We also see quite a few different stories, particularly in the 18th and very early 19th century, of fairies appearing and asking to borrow hand mills. A hand mill, as I understand it, was a small handheld, sort of, if you can picture a coffee grinder, for anyone that's familiar with that, a handheld coffee grinder. It's got a crank on the side and you turn it. You would put the wheat or the barley or oatmeal on the top, turn it, and it would grind it so that you could make, that particular day's batch of bread without having to take your wheat or your oats or what have you all the way to the larger mill and grind up a larger amount. So we see various accounts of fairies appearing to ask the loan of a hand mill, which appears to be something that they did not have themselves, because this is sort of a whole strata of stories in the folklore, this borrowing of hand mills. Which is also interesting because fairies in general, for quite a while in the 18th and 19th centuries, were very well known for borrowing the use of human mills, the full-sized large ones, particularly at night. There's quite a lot of accounts of when the workers would finish and leave for the day, the fairies would come in at night and work the mill, and that humans who tried to stay in the mill at night or work in the mill at night would have a lot of issues and basically be driven out. And it was considered better to just leave the mill to the fairies at night so that they could use it as they needed to. So I guess that's another example, actually, of borrowing. They clearly needed the use of that little bit of human technology for their own purposes. We also see in some accounts examples and stories of humans who would overhear fairies talking about needing a particular implement or tool, sometimes related to baking, sometimes related to harvesting, and usually in the story, the human would then whittle or carve the necessary tool and leave it out, and then the tool would disappear, of course, and then for that bit of kindness, the person would be repaid, usually with food. Now, as a general rule, it's not a good idea to eat fairy food. I should probably do a whole video on that as well, but you usually don't want to eat fairy food. It does not work out well for the human most of the time. But in this case, the food that was being left was owed to the human. It was a repayment for a kindness that the human had done, or in that specific case, a gift, an item that the human had made or given to the fae folk. It does fall under the category of borrowing. It's usually listed among borrowing stories, I guess because the repayment aspect is involved, which is why I'm including it here. But that's another common thing that we see. This idea that if you would lend them, or in some cases just outright give them, an aspect of, or I shouldn't say an aspect, an item of human technology or a tool that they needed, that they would repay that kindness. Fairies in general are very big on making sure that they're not in debt to humans, and that they always repay any goodness that is done to them. Not always in kind, as I've said, but always in the same spirit, we'll say. So effectively, when we look at this subject across the whole sort of scope of what we talked about in the last 20 minutes, we see this idea of fairies needing human assistance or human involvement in order to succeed in their own endeavors in certain cases, whether that's engaging in warfare or sport in some cases, whether that's the more malicious fairy host needing human participation to harass other humans, whether it's fairies needing a human midwife to deliver fairy babies, whether it's them needing to borrow the loan of food to bake their own bread, which would be repaid later, or literally just borrow food, which would be repaid later. I just said grain to borrow bake their own bread. Making a video, I can't even speak today. Or whether they would literally be borrowing physical items, the loan of physical items, or the use of, in the case of the mills, pieces of human technology, places that they needed to use in order to manufacture or make things for themselves that they needed at the time. There's also some hints in folklore of them using looms or interfering with human looms, both for good and for ill. So that aspect does come into it as well. So when we look across this entire sort of very quickly covered genre, we can see that there is this very deep intertwining between humans and sort of human industry. Not obviously what we consider now after the Industrial Revolution industry, but the older sort of concept of industry in the sense of humans creating and making and hand manufacturing things, and fairies. It's often discussed in the older folkloric material that basically the way that human beings used to live their lives is the exact same way that fairies would live their lives. Baking bread, planting, harvesting, weaving, the exact same way that humans used to live a couple hundred years ago is the way that fairies were understood to live a couple hundred years ago. Does raise the very interesting question, now that humans have very quickly shifted into considerably different approaches to living in most places. I shouldn't even say most places, because that's inaccurate. In America, in large stretches of America, in areas that are divorced from that approach to living, where you are growing your own food, harvesting your own food, making all your own clothes, where we're much more reliant on mechanical technology, computerized technology. What does that mean for fairy borrowing and this intertwining between fairies and humans? It's an interesting thing to contemplate. They certainly have always, throughout the history of fairy stories and the anecdotal material, seemed to keep pace with humans, with human development. You know, when we look at Reverend Kirk's writings, when we look at Campbell's writings, when we look at really the whole broad spectrum of what we have for folkloric material and anecdotal material, we see that the fair folk have always been within a generation or two, if not contemporary to the humans they were encountering, in how they dressed, in how they spoke, in how they acted, in the technology they themselves were using. So it certainly raises some interesting questions as to how they would be today if you interacted with them. And I do think that we do still see these anecdotal encounters of people with the fair folk, and the idea that they do still have this interdependence and reliance on us and connection to us. I don't think people talk about it as much. I don't think people are as open and willing to discuss encounters, or potentially as aware when they're occurring. So just a little food for thought as we end this video. I'm going to do at least several more that I have in mind. I will do one on changelings for sure. And I think I want to do one sort of discussing the modern concept of fairies as more ecological nature spirits versus sort of the older understanding of them. We'll see where that goes. But a little food for thought as we end today. You know, I've asked in a previous video, would you recognize one of the fair folk if you saw them, considering that we have such a very antiquated, shall we say, view of how they would look and how they would live, and also our modern understanding being what it is. But definitely keep in mind that this symbiotic connection that the fair folk and humans have always had, there's no reason to think that's any different today. Perhaps our perception of it is more blunted than it used to be. So give that a little bit of thought. And hopefully this video did help clarify the different ways that the fair folk have always been connected to humans and have had some degree of reliance on humans. We, of course, also have different types of reliance on them. Maybe I should do a video about that as well. Have a nice day, everyone, and I will see you next time.